Imagine standing in the center of a rotting wooden courtroom at the edge of the Caribbean Sea. The heat is unbearable, sweat drips from your brow, and the crowd stares not with sympathy, but hunger. You're a pirate, yes, but your crime wasn't stealing gold. It was breaking a code deeper than any law: loyalty. In the colonial world, pirate trials weren't about justice. They were about control, power, and fear. What happened inside those trials will shock you. Let's uncover the truths that history books quietly erased. When we think of pirates, we often picture chaos men with no rules, no morals, only greed. But the truth is far more complex. Most pirate crews followed a strict code, one that was written, voted on, and enforced by the crew itself. Known as Articles of Agreement, these rules covered everything from the distribution of treasure to medical compensation for lost limbs. Violating these rules could get you whipped, marooned, or even executed by your own crew. So when a pirate was caught and dragged into a colonial court, he wasn't just defending himself against British law. He was defending his reputation under the Pirate Code. But colonial authorities had no interest in pirate codes. To them, a pirate was a symbol of rebellion against empire, and the trials were public performances meant to reaffirm state power. Many pirate trials lasted less than an hour. Evidence rarely needed. Testimonies often false. If you were caught near a known pirate ship or had sea maps in your pocket, you were as good as guilty. The courts used a terrifying legal weapon: the Admiralty Court. Unlike common trials, these were held without a jury and often in secret. The judge had full power to declare guilt, and the sentences were often brutal: hanging, drowning, or being left to rot in a cage above the harbor. Worse, your body would be displayed for weeks, a message to any sailor dreaming of freedom. Yet some pirates fought back with words. One famous case is that of Charles Vane, who, even while shackled and bleeding, gave a defiant speech declaring that he was no more a criminal than the kings who sent men to slaughter for gold. His words were erased from most official records, but survived in whispers passed down through generations. Even more chilling is the fact that many of these trials were based on confessions, often obtained through torture. The colonial courts didn't just want to punish. They wanted stories. Pirates were pressured to name names, to confess to crimes they never committed, just to entertain the crowds or build cases against rival nations. In a twisted way, pirates became propaganda tools, scapegoats for the empire's own violent conquest. And while some pirates were hardened criminals, many were just desperate men, escaped slaves, starving fishermen, orphan boys. They weren't evil. They were abandoned by a system that gave them no other choice. Now that you've seen what the courts looked like, wait until you hear what happened to those who dared to break the silence. When we imagine a trial, we picture fairness. A judge, a jury, evidence, a defense. But in the colonial era, pirate trials were often nothing more than theatrical performances, predetermined, politically motivated, and shockingly unjust. Many pirates never stood a real chance. From the moment they were captured, their fate was sealed. These trials were usually held in admiralty courts, and they were unlike anything we'd recognize today. There was no jury of peers. Instead, judges appointed by the crown oversaw proceedings, and their primary mission wasn't justice, it was deterrence. The British Empire, desperate to protect its trade routes, didn't want truth. It wanted examples. Pirate trials were a form of public theater meant to terrify sailors into obedience. Many of the accused didn't even speak English. They were from Africa, Spain, or the Caribbean. They couldn't understand the charges or defend themselves. In some cases, interpreters weren't even provided. Testimonies were based on hearsay or coerced confessions. Torture was common, especially at sea. Sailors were whipped, starved, or beaten until they confessed. And once those words were recorded, they were treated as irrefutable truth in court. One of the most infamous examples was the trial of Captain Charles Vane. Known for his rebellious spirit, Vane was feared not only for piracy, but for rejecting colonial rule. When captured in Jamaica, he was paraded through the streets like a trophy. In court, no real evidence was presented, only the word of rival pirates who had cut deals to save their own lives. Vane was found guilty in under an hour. He was hanged. The next day, another dark practice involved the Act of Grace, pardons, amnesties offered by the Crown to pirates willing to surrender. But there was a catch. Many pirates who turned themselves in under this promise of mercy were later betrayed. Colonial governors claimed the deadline had passed or the terms had changed. Some were rearrested and tried anyway. The system lured them in, then condemned them. Worse still, pirate trials often blurred the line between criminal and political punishment. Some men were declared pirates simply for resisting unfair treatment aboard merchant ships. If a sailor mutinied after being beaten or starved by his captain, he could be labeled a pirate, especially if the ship was taken to a neutral or enemy port. Colonial courts made no distinction between desperate rebellion and organized piracy. This abuse of power extended even further. Black pirates and indigenous crew members were rarely given any form of trial. Many were executed on sight or quietly disposed of. There are entire ship manifests missing from historical records, crew lists erased after trials that were never written down. The silence around these disappearances speaks volumes. The biggest secret of all? These trials were never about law. They were about protecting colonial profits. Every pirate was a threat to the economic machine of empire, an interruption in the constant flow of gold, sugar, cotton, and slaves. And so the courts were designed not to uncover truth, but to preserve control. Some colonial governors even turned the trials into public events. Gallows were built in view of the sea so incoming ships would witness executions before even docking. Sermons were preached, warning of divine punishment. Children were brought to watch hangings as moral lessons. In this way, pirate justice became a tool not just of the state, but of culture, turning brutality into righteousness. The truth is chilling. If you were captured and labeled a pirate, you weren't walking into a courtroom, you were walking into a trap. And the world would remember you not as a man or a woman, but as a warning. In the colonial world, pirate trials didn't end with the judge's sentence. They ended with a spectacle. And that spectacle wasn't just about justice. It was about fear, control, and public manipulation. Executions weren't done in the shadows. They were carefully staged events meant to send a message. This is what happens when you challenge the empire. In cities like Port Royal, Boston, and London, thousands gathered to witness the final moments of the condemned. Gallows were built near the sea, where the salty wind carried the sound of drums and the cries of the doomed. These weren't quiet, respectful proceedings. They were loud, dramatic, and theatrical, complete with clergy, soldiers, and crowds. Hungry for a show, pirates were sometimes forced to read their confessions aloud, often written for them by colonial officials. These statements, filled with scripted repentance and warnings to others, were used to paint the empire as merciful and just. In reality, many of these confessions were written under duress or entirely fabricated. The goal wasn't truth, it was narrative control. After the hanging, the body of the pirate didn't always go to a grave. In many cases, it was covered in tar, placed in an iron cage called a gibbet, and hung near the harbor, left to rot for weeks or even months. Sailors docking in port would see the swinging corpses before they even stepped off the ship. This grotesque display wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda. A warning to every seafarer: defy the crown, and this will be your fate. One of the most notorious examples is the case of Captain William Kidd. Once a respected privateer, he was accused of piracy in a complex legal battle that many historians now consider deeply flawed. But his execution in 1701 was massive. Thousands gathered at Execution Dock in London. His body, after death, was gibbeted and displayed over the Thames for years as a symbol of the empire's reach and its thirst for obedience. Even the sermons delivered at these executions served a purpose. Preachers were chosen to speak of divine judgment, portraying pirates as sinners damned by God. But often, these sermons had political undertones, reminding the people that the monarchy was appointed by heaven, and rebellion, even on the sea, was rebellion against the divine order itself. Women and children were encouraged to attend. Schoolteachers brought students. Vendors sold snacks. It was a strange, brutal carnival of justice. Pirate deaths became lessons, but not in ethics, in obedience. And over time, this transformed the perception of pirates in the public mind, not just as criminals, but as enemies of order, civilization, and faith. What the authorities feared most wasn't piracy. It was the idea of freedom without permission. Pirates created their own codes, shared wealth, and elected leaders that terrified empires built on hierarchy. So executions were more than punishment. They were public rebranding, turning rebels into villains, and making sure the people watching never forgot who held the rope. Asterisk. Behind the spectacle and the so-called justice of colonial pirate trials, there was a darker layer that history rarely dares to highlight: the brutal influence of race and class. While popular culture paints pirates as lawless white men in tricorn hats, the truth was far more complex and far more disturbing. Many of those tried and executed as pirates were men of color, poor sailors, or enslaved individuals who had escaped bondage and found temporary freedom among pirate crews. Pirate ships were, ironically, some of the most diverse vessels on the ocean. Freed Africans, indigenous sailors, poor Europeans, and even escaped slaves often served together. Some pirate captains, like Black Sam Bellamy, welcomed those rejected by colonial society. In fact, pirate codes were often more democratic than those of any nation. They allowed crew members to vote, share loot equally, and even select their leaders. This radical equality deeply threatened the strict racial and class hierarchies of the empires. When captured, white pirates especially, those with connections or wealth, were sometimes spared or given lighter sentences. But black and indigenous pirates were almost always executed without mercy. Their trials were rushed, their rights ignored, and their stories erased. Many didn't even make it to trial. They were hanged on suspicion alone, sometimes without formal charges, their bodies buried in unmarked graves or thrown into the sea. Their voices were never recorded. Their resistance was silenced before it could be remembered. Some colonial records reveal that enslaved men were accused of piracy simply for being on a pirate ship, even if they had been forced aboard. The British and Spanish courts had no interest in nuance. To them, a black man with a sword on a stolen vessel was a threat that had to be eliminated, regardless of how he got there. These injustices were systemic, calculated, and designed to protect the empire's control. And what about women? Though rare, there were female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read who defied every expectation of their time. But even they were treated differently depending on their social status and relationships. Some were imprisoned for life, others were executed. Their stories were either sensationalized into legend or buried in shame. The truth is, pirate trials were never just about crime. They were about preserving power, about deciding who had the right to rebel and who didn't, who deserved a voice and who didn't. And in this theater of so-called justice, the ones who suffered most were those at the bottom, those who had dared to imagine another way to live. So, next time you hear a tale of pirates swinging from the gallows, ask yourself, whose story is being told? And whose was left to rot in silence? If this part of history shocked you, don't let the story stop here. Hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel, because in our next episode, we'll reveal the pirate codes that challenged kings. broke empires, and nearly changed the course of the Atlantic world. You won't believe what they got right.